Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us as we unpack the first set of findings from the Absa Psyche Small Business Growth Index. My name is Zelda Masondo, Area Segment Manager at Absa Business Banking, and I'll facilitate the discussions this afternoon. SMEs plays a critical role in South Africa, not just as engines for job creation, but as a pillars of community support. With this in mind, the intentions behind this research project was really to address the critical need for information about the factors impacting small business growth in South Africa. So what you'll hear today in terms of the findings is really the voice of small businesses in South Africa. It is our hope that this will serve as a springboard for further support and targeted interventions that can help SMEs to thrive. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. To my left, it's Jeff Gable, Chief Economist at Absa. We also have Prof. Dion Tastin, CEO at the Bureau of Market Research, who will provide more color to the research findings. You'll also hear from Mr. Ellen Mokoki, CEO of South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And then later, we will also hear from Linda Mbadra, Head of Strategic Business and Partnership Development at Absa. He will highlight some of the steps that Absa has been taking to support the SMEs businesses. As you listen to today to our speakers, remember to send your questions, comments on the chat for our Q&A later in the broadcast. And please state your name and the business you represent. And with that, I will now hand over to Jeff. Jeff, over to you. Thank you.
Zelda, thank you for that introduction, and thanks everyone watching us online here for participating in today. It's really very exciting to be thinking about sort of small and medium enterprise in South Africa. We know that it's the backbone of sort of growth. It's the engine of employment in the country, even if sometimes perhaps our politicians and big business seems to forget it. My role in today is to sort of do a little bit of scene setting. So very much top down, but thinking about some of the big drivers for South Africa, for the economy, for the direction going forward. And then after my talk, then we'll get into the real grit of the day and think about what small business, small enterprises is telling us and what's next. So on that side, you will know when you invite an economist, you get a bunch of slides, you get a fair few graphs and the odd table, and so the next 15 minutes are going to look an awful lot like that. But what I thought I would do is start off in quite a broad way, because often as an economist, we sit here and each and every piece of data. So a little bit earlier today, for example, the most recent inflation data came out, and we're going to focus on the number was 3.5. Maybe some people thought it was going to be 3.6, 3.7. It all feels very frictional. So I wanted to start the talk today in taking a bigger step back. And I think one of the most important things we need to appreciate in South Africa is it hasn't just been 1 month of difficult business condition or 1 quarter or 1 year. We've been in this quite a long time. So if we think about the graph in front of us right now, you'll see it looks like this big red wave. And within that big red wave, there's one very narrow element of that. There's one narrow black bar. And why that bar is so narrow is because it's one country, it's South Africa. Why the wave is so wide is there's 194 countries there. And it's not asking the question, how fast did South Africa grow last quarter compared to the rest of the world, or last year, or even since COVID. This looks over the last 10 years. So good times, bad times, where did we sit within sort of our global peers? And where you want to be on this graph is far to the right. I mean, you want to be growing as fast as possible. You want to feel like an India. You want to feel like a China here on the continent. You want to feel like a Kenya, a Uganda, a Tanzania. You want those high growth environments, because then in that space, in a rising market, it's just easier for everybody. And you'll see South Africa's not there. We're very, very far to the left. So of those 190 odd countries, we're somewhere in the low 20s. So it's been a very long slog. And that's important, right? Because if you think about the discussions we had February, March, April as a country, with the finance minister trying to push ahead with a budget, this question about whether there'd be a VAT increase or not, all of that is because we're living in a very, very constrained environment. When we think about the most recent employment data, if we think about the opportunities and many of the things that we'll see from the small business survey, all of this reflects an environment, right? A pie that's just not growing. One of the things that's really critical for this, of course, in each business needs to make the decision that's appropriate for them, and then they need to find some finance, they need to find some business partners in the way they go. But what we see, if we think about over time, so not any particular year, and if we think about cross countries, not just in South Africa, which countries are countries that grow really fast? Well, countries that grow really fast are countries that invest a lot. Right? Give up maybe some spending today to build sort of a stronger future tomorrow. And you'll see that in your household when you run your personal finances. You'll see that as a business as well, right? We can take profits out of the business today, or we can invest those profits and expect an even bigger business tomorrow. And so when we think about that question for South Africa, the story that comes out is probably a little bit challenging, right? So the graphic here is looking at gross fixed capital formation. It's just investment. And we think about investment in the lowest, the red bar there, which is the investment as proportion of the overall economy from business, private sector. And we see that peaked back in 2007, 8, when the economy was flying, right? We couldn't move but for generating jobs and opportunity. And we see that's come well off. The orange bars in the middle, that's investment by government. So that would be in schools and hospitals, all the municipal investment that we know that we need. In the top third of this, the darkest bars, that's the state-owned companies. And so you can see, for example, in the early 2010s, as we were really moving a lot of dirt and installing a lot of machinery in Medupi and Kusile and others, you see that state-owned corporate investment went much higher. But without all that detail in mind, where are we now? Stronger than immediately after COVID. But as a proportion of GDP, about 15%, which isn't far off depreciation rates, which means in many parts of South Africa, you're barely, so you might feel like you're running, but you're running to stand still. And so we need to find an environment where business feels confident enough to invest today for tomorrow. We think about in the mining sector, for example, they have these horrific statistics that suggest in real terms, you take inflation out of it, new exploration investment in South Africa today is barely a sixth of where it was 15 years ago. Now, if you're not investing in exploration and mining today, you don't know where to dig the hole tomorrow. And if you don't dig the hole tomorrow, you don't have mining and mining jobs 5 years out or 10 years out. So this is a real challenge. And of course, one of the things you need in that space for investment decisions to be made is you need a certain amount of certainty, right? You need to understand the rules of the game because you're taking your own capital, you're taking the capital of shareholders, and you're saying, well, you can't access that now. I'm going to invest it for the next 5 or 10 years. And the global environment for that has not been made much easier, right? So if we think about the global environment that we find ourselves in, well, the 2025 hasn't been a very comfortable one. So we're learning a lot about trade at one level. We're learning about geopolitics in another level. It seems odd, but even just agreeing basic facts, right? We think we have a trade surplus with the US. They believe we have a trade surplus, but they believe our trade surplus with them is vastly larger than we think it is. So simple stuff like that even is sometimes very hard to agree. We know as South Africa, again, just through this very narrow trade lens, we know that in some ways we are really focused. There's a few product lines that matter a lot to us when we trade with the United States. So our precious metals are a really important part of that. More than a third of our exports that go to the US are precious metals. And the way they count them, it's more than half of our exports. The vehicle sector, right? Whether you are Mercedes in East London or whether you are BMW in Roslyn, the US is an important market in this space. But there's also lots and lots and lots of other sectors there. There's more than 2,000 product lines in South Africa where our total trade with the US is less than $10 million. But if that's a business that you are in, that product line is absolutely critical. And so the tweets that are coming from the White House are really very challenging in this space. What have we seen so far? And so we had the first quarter data, then we had the second quarter, so that's kind of carries us over Liberation Day, though remember in many cases the worst of the tariffs were sort of pulled back, but now from early August they're on us. So the way to read the table in front of us, it says that for South Africa's total exports to the United States, in the first quarter, they were down about 12% from where we were a year earlier. And in the second quarter, that accelerated that decline to almost 20%. And then you can look in those product groups. Remember, precious metals are ones in which we don't have any tariffs, but there's still minuses there. The US economy is just growing less quickly than it was before. That second set, starting with fruits and nuts and working down, those are areas that up until early August were now tariffed. You used to not have a tariff, but it was only a tariff about 10%. Now it's going to 30. In that space, the range of outcomes has been much, much larger. So in some areas, in fruit and nuts, we've actually exported more this year than last year, though one wonders whether we're just benefiting from a strong harvest and trying to get things to the US before the real draconian rules come in. We see the same thing in different preparations of vegetable and fruits, jams and what have you. It's been a great period to export to the United States, but every evidence is that that's come probably to a crashing halt now. And then you see at the bottom of the table some of our heavy industry that have been hit already with larger tariffs. So whether it be in steel, sort of aluminium, iron, steel in that space, 25% tariff potential to rise going forward. We've seen already in the second quarter a 20% decline. And those are jobs in South Africa. And you see in vehicles and related, that's all engines and other kinds of car parts, catalytic converters and what have you. Exports to the United States fell by half compared to a year earlier. So this is not making things easier. What are the next steps in this space? Well, it's kind of very hard, frankly, it's very hard to know, right? We've seen some other big global economies get on the wrong side of the US administration. So India is facing 50% tariffs on its products. Brazil is facing 50% import tariffs on its products to the US right now. So in some ways we could say 30 could be worse. But it's very, very difficult in that environment. And we see in the newspaper every day these discussions about what is it that the US might be asking us to do, whether it be adjusting our policies around empowerment, critical for things like parts of the SME sector, whether it be thinking about opening some of our markets to the US and food and other products, let's see. But it's not a helpful environment. What do countries do in this space? Well, I'm pleased to say South Africa in many ways is doing kind of, best practice here. What you need to do is you need to get your house in order if the global environment is moving against you. And so we saw reforms in the energy sector already starting in earnest, in some cases as much as a decade ago, as Eskom ran out of power for us for 18 years ago now. But what we're also seeing is this acceleration of reforms in water, this acceleration in reforms in logistics. So the busiest container port on the continent, Durban Pier 2, it's caught up in the courts right now, but the political decision's been made, the business decision's been made to put that in the hands of the private sector, let them run this, get our country up and running in a more efficient way. And with Operation Vulindlela, the second part of this, we'll see additional focus on some of those things that we all face day to day, either in our business or in our personal lives. It's about the way municipalities are run. It's about addressing sort of the spatial inequality that exists in South Africa. So there's an awful lot of really important reforms that are happening here. A second set of reform, and it caught us maybe a little bit unawares, but is really important, is what's going on with the inflation target. And now it might feel very academic. The governor of the Reserve Bank saying he's going to target as a central bank a preference for 3% inflation versus 4.5%. You can imagine people's eyes glazing over and only economists being excited about this. But I really need to motivate that this is desperately important for everybody involved here in the economy and SMEs in particular. So what are the likely benefits of this? Well, if we can generate lower inflation on a sustained basis in South Africa, we should protect South Africa's most vulnerable. Those sat there on a social assistance monthly check. Every rand matters. And so lower inflation in that space makes it the margin. It's a tough job, but at the margin makes it easier to provide basic food and basic security for families, for those tens of millions of South Africans that are super exposed. But for those of us in the business sector, it also means more certainty for investment. It's less likely that you need to plan for both interest rates of 6 or 7% and interest rates for 17 or 20%. It should also over time provide for lower financing costs broadly. And so there's a lot of focus on this right in the near term. From the Reserve Bank side, what they're talking about in this space is that guys compared a target of 4.5%, they might see a 4.5% inflation target that would see the repo rate more or less flat, the orange line in this graph, more or less flat from where we are right now. A successful adoption of a lower inflation target in the Reserve Bank's mind should mean that fairly soon we will start to see interest rates that are that much lower. That helps with new financing for a business. The hurdle rate of whether the project makes sense or not is just that much easier. But also for anybody set with financing already, frees up a little bit more money at the end of the month as well. So this is really vitally important. Like everything in economics, there's a little complication here, right? There's this question of the cost of credibility. How tough does the Reserve Bank need to be before we believe that inflation will be 3 and we stop asking our employer for wage increases of 6 or 7 or 10? And then there is this little nuance between the finance minister and the governor not quite seeing eye to eye on this. But I think this is a detail that will work its way through. The big story here is that we should be lining ourselves up for a more competitive interest rate going forward, making business a little bit easier. I want to finish just on 1 or 2 slides here with the time that I have left. One is just on consumers. So one of the things that we see as a bank, when we look through our cards data, just all the transactions that we see coming through, we can say some general things about the consumer in South Africa. So one of the things that we see in this space is that we're getting a lot of polarization across provinces. In general, we're seeing there's down trading, right, in all the provinces except Western Cape and Gauteng. We are seeing that the well-to-do, kind of the sense that if you're wealthy in South Africa, you know, if you think things are tough, you must imagine how much tougher it is for everybody else. But we're seeing annual spend growing still in sort of the wealthiest level of South Africans. We're seeing middle income segments that are very much consolidating their spending. So kind of no new spending, but some interesting variations within that spend. And then if you think about entry level consumers or students, the pressure is on big. So we saw spending fall almost 10% last year. That's nothing to ignore in that space. We've seen financial services, people accessing financial products rise in important ways, and we've seen quite a bit of pessimism, right? So when we get some good data out, people feel good, but not for very long. When they get some bad data out, it reinforces their belief that the environment is tough and it's going to get tougher. And so that generates this environment where spending is often very defensive. People think twice about the sort of spending they're going to do. And then my very last slide, and I want to think about what this means for brands and spending going forward. And I think the vehicle sector is a super interesting part of that. Because at one level, we talk about this very tough economy. If we take a look either in the pinkish line here or the white line, the white is new vehicle sales, the pink line is used vehicle sales. You look at either of them, volume sales are back up to where we were just before COVID. Doesn't look like any problem at all. But in the detail in this space, what we see is that consumers are purchasing vehicles. They're making those decisions in very different ways than they did before. So whilst a country like South Africa used to be one of Mercedes' biggest market penetration markets in the world, the proportion of new vehicles sold that were Mercedes. In South Africa, we were second only to Germany in that statistic. German luxury brands have really gotten thumped in this space. Within, there's a rotation. You see a rotation from, how many people on visiting us today, their very first vehicle was a Volkswagen, right? And we'll talk about your age, whether it was a Polo or whether it was a Golf or a City Golf, but in that space. But we're seeing a rotation from some brands to others and this emergence of new entrants. So people are still looking for new vehicles. People are still buying vehicles in South Africa, but looking at very different brand allegiances at very different price points than before. So that's kind of the environment I wanted to leave us with. I hope that was helpful. Zelda, happy to pass back to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Food for the thought, indeed. I would now like to hand over to Prof. Dion Tustin, CEO at the Bureau of Market Research, to take us through the research findings and also the recommendations. Prof, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zelda, and thank you for the opportunity. And good afternoon to everyone this afternoon, and a special welcome to the small businesses with big voices who have joined the call this afternoon. For Absa, the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and the Bureau of Market Research at UNISA, today marks a very important milestone for small business and the Small Business Growth Index project. To us today, Zelda, it's more than just a presentation of numbers and data. It's about the voices behind the numbers. So I think it is appropriate to thank all 1,600 small businesses, the owners and managers and representatives who have shared their experiences with us. We are now well positioned to reflect together on the real challenges and opportunities shaping our small business ecosystem of South Africa. And maybe, Zelda, for too long, the small business voices have often been scattered or maybe even unheard. Now, the Small Business Growth Index challenges this. It brings for us those voices together to lead and to be clear and to be collective. If we look at the slides that we will be talking to in terms of the research, there we go, thank you. We will be first reflecting on 8 key findings coming from the survey. And I'm not going to read through all those 8 because I'm going to deal with them separately. Now, the first focus area that we want to reflect on, and where the whole survey also starts, is looking at recent performances and operational metrics for the past 12 months prior to the survey. Now, the Small Business Ambassador Survey, like we like to refer to it, was conducted in April, May 2025, and it captures the voices, as I mentioned, of 1,600 small businesses, offering then a 12-month reflection of performance and their operations. Now, if we look at the statistics, a reflection on the business performance, for example, show that about a quarter of the small firms managed to grow in the past 12 months. Yet, nearly half contracted or traded with difficulty, with 10% indicating that they are at risk of closure. If we reflect on the financial metrics, one notes from the data that both your revenue and profits declined for many of the small businesses who voiced themselves, with profit erosion outpacing revenue loss, reflecting margin pressures. Even if we reflect on employment, we see that 2/3 of firms have held staff levels steady, while about a quarter cut jobs and only almost 10% added staff. And then reflecting on a bit more positive note from the survey results, showcasing an increase in digital adoption. Online trading was the only strong growth area when reflecting on the past 12 months, with about 35% of the small businesses increasing their digital revenue. And then also to contribute at the strategic level, our strategic analysis shows strategic imperatives emerging for small businesses. And those who are surviving, as we have seen in the survey, are those who need to defend and grow their margins, reflecting by streamlining cost, in other words, tightening your cost structures, that's what's required for now, and applying value-led pricing. Regarding talent resilience, that we're also reflecting in the survey, small businesses who survive retain their skill sets, but also need to adopt flexible staffing models. And then coming back to digital acceleration, those who survive currently have been scaling e-commerce specifically and have been enhancing data and technology capacities as a core growth driver. And this delta brings us to one of the evidence which we reinforce in the Small Business Growth Index core principle. And we're saying, by measuring the small business ecosystem it becomes possible to manage it effectively. If we turn our attention then to the next slide on reflecting on the cost of doing business in the past 12 months. Small businesses have faced severe and broad-based cost inflation. And Jeff, you referred to the pricing and the inflation. And it's especially transportation and fuel costs showing the steepest increase among about 2/3 of the small businesses who participated in the survey. And then we see concerns between 50 and 60% of our small businesses showcasing increased cost in terms of utilities, water, electricity, and then the raw materials, stock, and added to that, the borrowing, rentals, wage, and even cost on taxes, further straining or adding to the strain of small businesses. And what's the impact of this? Profitability we're seeing from the survey has eroded. Cash flow has weakened. And many firms have shifted to what we call a short-term cost containment measurement, just to stay afloat. And then we put a bit of a future lens into this survey, which reveals that up to 75% of our small businesses indicated that they plan to raise in the next 6 months their prices. You refer to prices, between 6 and 10%, some of the indications of the price increases, then with a strategy to offset rising cost. Now the businesses are saying to us, without relief, many face an increasing risk of closure, underscoring the fragility of resilience in the sector. And for us, the key insight says that South Africa's small businesses are operating in an escalating cost environment where their capacity to absorb shocks is rapidly diminishing. Zelda, we move on to the Small Business Growth Index Barometer. So those of you who have read the report, and we've made that report available to our small businesses who participated. And what we're trying to do with this barometer, we are saying that we want to consolidate the outcome of all measures that we have included in the survey to come up with a barometer score. And that score ranges from 0 to 100. A score closer to 0 showcases a business ecosystem in distress, whereas scores closer to 100 in the green area showcases or reflecting higher levels of confidence and also growth prospects, which is positive. So the pulse check, or the compass if you like, in small businesses have been established at a score this year, then in the first half of this year at 51 index points. And the baseline showcases that we are looking at small businesses in the ecosystem being vulnerable, or in the vulnerable band between 50 and 59. And this position, Zelda, indicates that our small businesses are neither thriving nor collapsing. They are surviving, but mainly with highly exposure to some risk, which we will highlight as well, and also dependent on the external conditions which Jeff have outlined, and some uncertain features facing the businesses specifically. So the insights of the Small Business Growth Index survey does not necessarily show overblown enthusiasm, but rather so cautious optimism. And we see that firms who are anticipating growth in the next 12 months are more or less on par with those currently experiencing growth, but the shift is less about expansion. It's more about stability, signaling businesses who expect that they will be weathering the storm, being strong, and scale aggressively. And then also interesting to note from the analysis, it reveals a declining acute stress. When we reflect on the 12 months ahead, fewer firms reporting trading with difficulty and being at risk of closure is being noted from the data. And this shows that the worst pressures may be easing, but optimism is really conditional here. And the SMME requires that external reinforcement which you refer to, reliable energy, affordable credit, and reduced cost pressure. And then the beauty of the survey, Zelda, the hope that steps in as a driving force. The cautious optimism that we're seeing in the survey is associated with strong hope, the belief that conditions will improve. And this mindset for us as a research team highlights that the gap between the current harsh realities, the high cost that we referred to, the tight liquidity, the weak demand, as opposed to the future expectations for a better environment. And then we turn to a very important portion of the survey looking at survival and support needs of businesses. And the survey highlights mounting survival pressure under sustained cost inflation. So in the survey, especially, your short-term risk are very clearly pronounced. We are noting about a third of small businesses indicating that they can only survive up to 6 months under the current cost pressure that we're talking about this afternoon, and without further intervention or support. And then the message around medium-term strain. A further 1 in 5 businesses expects only to last for 7 to 12 months from now. But also, maybe more concerning, about half of them showcasing they are at risk of closure within the year to come if no relief is provided. But with reference to long-term resilience, we're seeing around 10% of those businesses which indicated that they can extend or survive beyond 2 years under the prevailing conditions. And how are they trying to cope? The statistic shows that 75% of businesses, as I mentioned, plan to increase their inflation between the 6 and 10% which I indicated. So the message is clear. Immediate and targeted policy interventions will be essential to ensure continuity of small businesses and, in broader scope, safeguarding livelihoods, sustaining employment, and also protecting future growth prospects. And then a critical component of the survey revealing critical skills and knowledge gaps being regarded as further additional barriers to grow small businesses. If we look at a bit of a deeper diving into the statistics on skills and development, we're seeing that especially digital and cyber competencies being rated as critically weak. Only 10% of managers and owners feel confident in cybersecurity, around 12% confident in digital management, very low percentages. So very few of the small businesses are actually equipped to leverage digital platforms or to safeguard against cyber threats. A second one that we're listing there, supply chain and sustainability capabilities, also reflecting being underdeveloped. Fewer than 1 in 5 of the small businesses said they feel confident in optimizing procurement or logistics or embedding sustainable practices. And sustainable practices right at the high end of the agenda of many businesses. And these gaps, surely I think you will agree, limit cost control and also competitiveness of businesses. And then a focus on sales, marketing and technology adoption, recording also among businesses a moderate capability. So we are seeing many of the small businesses need upskilling to expand, to grow into new markets. And new markets within a regional context, a national context, but as I mentioned, online specifically where we're seeing some growth happening. And then also challenged to adopt a data-driven approach to understand the customer market, to engage with them and to segment them according to need. And then there is inconsistent confidence, especially in core management skills. And we're talking finance, human resource and strategic management. And then, Zelda, we go on with the scope on skills and development, reflecting on the training, awareness of training opportunities and access to training. And it is evident from the research that nearly half of SMMEs are not confident about where to find and how to access that relevant training programs. And we're seeing actually a mismatch between the needs and the awareness. 27% showcase hard to fill vacancies, which exceeds the reported vacancies of around 23%, and this underscores to us structural skills shortages. And then hidden constraints comes to the fore as well. Even businesses without current vacancies may struggle to hire when they have new positions open, particularly in digital, managerial, and technical roles. So the implication for us is that the combination of low self-assessed skills, high vacancy pressures, and weak access to training support signals a deep structural change. And SMMEs cannot easily just acquire that talent and training that they desperately need to adapt, to innovate, and to grow. If we then turn our focus on finance conditions and access to capital, we see that there are several pressing challenges constraining business growth and resilience. The lack of working and investment capital, you reflected on the capital, Jeff, was the single biggest obstacle being mentioned. And many of the small businesses, they cannot scale operations, or they cannot upgrade equipment, or even respond effectively to market opportunities with inadequate capital. The second listed challenge, increased competition, where businesses have reported the growing pressure from both formal and informal rivals. Third listed, limited access to finance. So despite the availability of many government-backed loans and transports, the small businesses indicate that they still struggle to qualify due to strict eligible criteria, excessive bureaucracy, and weak institutional outreach. Importantly, maybe to note, besides the three that I just mentioned, ineffective marketing and then bringing it back to cash flow management also identified as key challenges and concerns among businesses. And I think, Zelda, you will agree that the success of the small business sector in our country will be critical for economic recovery, for job recreation, and also long-term inclusive growth. Yet, as I mentioned, persistent barriers around capital, financing, competition, and market access will continue to stifle the sector's potential, if not attended to. Then we are reflecting in this research under the utilization of support and advice providers, which is a critical component, because what we're seeing as outcomes is that many small businesses rely heavily on informal networks. They first turn to personal contacts, about a third of them relying on family and friends for guidance. You see self-reliance coming up very high, with about 1 in 5 said that they did not seek any support from anyone, showcasing that they're actually managing entirely on their own. And for us, it was interesting to see that there's an underutilization of formal resources. Professional, academic, and government support channels were engaged by only around 15% of SMMEs. Even around, Mr. Mukoki, 15% drew on business associations and trade associations, indicating to us limited collective representation. And then we see a moderate private sector uptake. Incubators, accelerators, and private consultants registered for some, but not at scale. If we then look at the cry out of businesses for support of government, the following has been mentioned. Easier access to finance, and specifically grants being mentioned by half of them. And this is a call out for streamlining loan and grant approved processes, Absa, expanding microfinancing and blended finance solutions. The second one, reducing the bureaucracy and red tape. And the third one, reducing the VAT, cited by about a third. So, Madam Facilitator, this dual view that I tried to sketch here, where SMMEs currently seek help versus what they what support they actually urgently demand from government. To us, that reflects or highlights key policy gaps. And we are saying and seeing in the data that SMMEs are not fully connected to the formal support ecosystems, which we think is important, as they require that targeted financial relief, regulatory simplification, and then also the cost alleviation to stabilize and grow. Second to last, business planning and looking forward. The survey highlights a cautious, optimistic outlook among small businesses for the next 12 months. While about a quarter of the businesses expecting moderate or strong growth, just below 40% anticipate stability, that stability that I referred to earlier, but then also maybe concerning another 33% of them, or 33%, foresee contraction or operational challenges to continue. And you will see from the slide the top concerns: the rising staff wages, cost of goods, energy cost, and power interruptions still at the back of the mind of small businesses. And despite these pressures, Madam Chair, small businesses demonstrated a hopeful, forward-looking mindset. Many plan to expand their reach, invest in new tools if new or additional capital comes available, and even explore markets beyond the current footprint, even mentioning the export market as possibilities. And this optimism to us is grounded in the belief of small businesses that conditions may improve, policy support may ease operational pressure, and their own initiatives such as digital expansion and export efforts, which I've mentioned earlier, will help to navigate that downturn. This cautious optimism signals both resilience but also opportunities, representing a critical workflow for policymakers and stakeholders to support these businesses. Madam Chair, I'm just highlighting some recommendations. The report is more than 50 pages, so it reflects more than just the recommendations shared, but the highlighted ones. Reducing barriers to access capital, and as proposed by business, by improving funding availability, Absa. Streamlining regulatory compliance by simplifying administrative processes. The third one that we highlighted there, strengthening skills training, which we talked about. Enhancing, very important, entrepreneurial and technical, that digital skills that were highlighted as top of the mind. And then very important, enhancing that advisory services which are not currently in place, providing tailored guidelines for informed decision making. And as we mentioned there, Madam Chair, and I'm closing on the highlights, that we have been starting to share, because we have promised the small businesses that we will not stop by the work of the research report gathering dust, but taking it further by sharing the results as we're doing here today, sharing it with government agencies. We've been collaborating with the small business department, and then also sharing it with the media and in the press to advocate on behalf of small businesses. I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Prof. Dion Tastin, and I believe that collectively working together, we will change this picture. So, moving along, we will now hand over to Mr. Ellen Mukoki, the CEO from the South African Chamber of Business and Industry. Mr. Ellen, over to you.
Thank you, Zelda, and thanks to Jeff for a very eloquent presentation, and to the Prof. It's difficult to follow the Prof. I always say to him when I joke with him that if he stopped doing what he's doing, he won't go hungry, because there are all these churches that he can start as a charismatic leader, because he speaks so brilliantly well when he tackles the subject matter. I think that as the South African Chamber of Commerce, of course, our main reason for existence is to play that intercession role in places like, in fora like NADLAC, for instance, where we deal with issues of policy, we deal with issues of regulation, legislation with all our social partners, be it big government, big labor groups, etc., etc. And in the final analysis, we're persuaded more by this thesis that to deal successfully and in a way that is very sustainable with the key problems that face South Africa, i.e., unemployment, poverty, inequality. We do need to create an environment where economic growth is going to happen, as Jeff, the economist, also stated very clearly in his presentation. And to that particular extent, the idea of decision making becomes very critical. Sometimes South Africans were very interesting people as a nation, because we all see what the problems are. I was at the National Dialogue just last week, and I start to make this observation that I make all the time, that almost 90 or 95% of people who raise their voice, who speak there, they are complaining. They are all talking about what the kinds of problems that we have. And it seems like there's a lot of consensus in terms of the problems that we're having, but there's not a lot of consensus in terms of how do we tackle these particular problems. And that's why I talk about this piece of decision making, because decision making is one of the very critical elements in terms of what we see. And if you look at what Jeff was presenting, you will see exactly when he compares all the 190 countries and ourselves in terms of where we are, that would rather be like an India or China. And if you look at the difference between ourselves and them, it's all about decision making, it's all about leadership, it's all about the extent to which we do judgment and decision making, and what is it that influences us to get into the positions that we actually get into. And so therefore, I will always talk as Saki about the 4 Ps, and we saw that it's people, it's purpose, it's the politics, and then it's policy. So these things must always work together, because if they don't work together, you're not necessarily going to go far. And in that particular regard, when we talk to policymakers, one of the things that we see, the big lacuna, is the huge asymmetry in terms of not just skills and competencies, but in terms of knowledge. And by knowledge, we don't mean what you get on social media or what you read written by a journalist in South Africa, because, of course, journalists are friends of ours. But the general trend is that journalists are people that we refer to as people who are inch deep and mile wide. In other words, I recall a few years ago when there was a gas explosion in the East Rand somewhere, and the journalist who was covering that story for one of the major TV networks covered that story, came to Lutuli House to talk to Mbalula about something unrelated to the gas explosion, and I was the third person that he spoke to about the business confidence index. So there's no way a person like that is going to be mile deep in terms of their understanding of the issues, because they have to have a bit of knowledge about a whole range of different things. So they could not possibly be the people who influence society in a way that is adequate, that is very deep, that is vigorous in terms of what are the options that we actually face. So to that extent, as we're walking around with Prof. Tustin, we're talking about this particular issue, because when you do any piece of research, long before all those research questions are actually being answered, the big question is, what is a research problem? What are you doing this for? What is the reason why you need to do the research, and the purpose for which you're actually trying to do it? And I think that Jeff covered all of that, even though he was not in those meetings, but he covered all of that in terms of his presentation, that these are the challenges that we face in South Africa in that particular regard. It then becomes very important to then galvanize and use our own networks, so that when the information has now come out with our partners, with Absa, with the Bureau for Market Research, how are we now going to go and pitch this information to the decision makers to influence them, so that we can even work with them in crafting the right policies. And Prof. Dion is quite correct. We don't want to just do the piece of research and then we put it in the files, and then we don't actually move forward to do something. I always say to young people in South Africa, young people like yourself, Zelda, that the Republic belongs to you. It doesn't belong to anyone else. It is South Africans themselves who must have a relationship with the Republic outside of the political parties, outside of the DNU. At an individual level, people need to be able to ask themselves a question: what is my relationship with the Republic? To that extent, what can I do in terms of contributing with ideas that can actually take us forward? So we do take this very, very seriously. We do think that decision making must be data driven. And the data and the quality of that particular data is going to enable us to get to a point where we need to get to. Because in a number of cases, And I'll give you interesting examples. 3 weeks ago, I was driving from Sandton, I'm coming to Pretoria. And as I get into Grayston, just before I get onto the freeway, I'm surprised why there's such a traffic jam. There's a huge traffic jam. I'm thinking maybe there's an accident ahead. I can't see anything on the apps. Waze is telling me something that I can't. It says something, but I couldn't understand. I couldn't read very properly. But as I get into the freeway, there are 3-4 Metro police officers there who are busy stopping cars right in the middle of a business day at 2:30 p.m., causing a 25-minute traffic jam in that environment. Now, I can't blame the traffic police. I probably can't blame the head of the Metro Police Department. I probably can't blame the mayor because he probably doesn't understand what the impact of that particular decision alone is in the general economy. There are so many small business trucks that were on that particular street that have to get to a place as it relates to productivity. And no one is thinking at that particular level. So a lot of the decisions get to be taken because people don't actually have the data. So now, as we move along with this particular development and this particular project, we're going to go and dig deeper into a lot of the things that are actually happening from a root cause analysis. And now we're able to sit down, when we sit down with the president, we're able to say, because you will see a dangerous phenomenon that is now developed, and with all respect to the president and his cabinet ministers, a dangerous thing that is now developed where even the president is complaining, even cabinet ministers are complaining. They all are complaining about, but why is the crime? But what the president at the National Dialogue even said, we need to ask the question why taps are running dry of water. But these are people who are supposed to be having the answers in the decision making. So that big lacuna, the gap that exists in terms of knowledge, not something that you read in the newspaper or on social media, key knowledge that is grounded, that is intellectually vigorous, which is what we're doing with UNIS and BMR, is going to be very central in us. And I suspect that starting with SMEs, we're going to actually end up creating a very huge template for the rest of South Africa in many of the areas where we actually experience challenges. So we dare not fail. And I think that for young people like yourself, Zelda, you should be excited about being in South Africa because we can actually solve the problems that happen to be in this particular environment as well as the region. You can't not be excited being here. This is a place where complexity, ambiguity, it's an ambidextrous environment full of risks, but also full of unbelievable opportunities. With those few words, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mukuki, and I am excited, and I'm hoping that the audience out there, they are also excited as I am. That brings us to our final speaker, Mr. Lindo Mbadra from Absa Strategic Business and Partnership Development. Over to you, Lindo.
Thank you very much, Zelda. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists. Thank you so much for setting the scene of all the work that's been done to kind of address some of the challenges that we are seeing in this space of small business. From my side, I'd also just like to thank our partners, Saki, also and the BMR as well, and the various teams that have worked tirelessly on this project to actually bring this, over the last few months, to actually bring this index to life. We really appreciate that. I'm going to take a few minutes as well just to share a brief snapshot of our SME business, and then also just share a bit more information about what we are currently doing to support small business as Absa. Obviously, bearing in mind the fact that the research is hot off the press, and we'll also be challenging ourselves to refine and enhance our solutions as a bank in terms of how we address some of the challenges that have been presented there over the coming months. So if you look at the SME landscape in South Africa, right, it's estimated that there are over 3 million SME businesses in the country, according to the latest, obviously, FinScope study. From an Absa perspective, we are responsible for relationships with about 300,000 of those businesses. So that's essentially 10% of the market there. In terms of how we define SME as a business, it's any business with a turnover of 50 million or less. Though we know that obviously definitions can vary, but more importantly, we recognize how diverse this group is. And that's why we call ourselves the Bank of the Entrepreneur, and we really, really immerse ourselves in terms of how we approach it. It's really important for us to support and reflect the diversity of this sector by solutioning for the specific needs that this segment has. And in recognizing that, obviously, we also recognize that partnership, mentorship, and collaboration are important in how we approach this space. So our teams bring deep sector expertise across at least 8 focus sectors, which we are currently focusing on as a business. And those are the wholesale, retail, and franchise space. Manufacturing is quite key for us. Transport and logistics as well are quite key for us as sectors. Renewables as well is a space that we're doing very well in terms of how we play and solution. And tourism as well, I think post-COVID is something that we've started to really focus our energies around in terms of solving for the issues on. So we continue to also prioritize women and youth-owned businesses as well as also the township economy space. We recognize the importance of the role that these individuals play in terms of how the economy of this country will perform in the future. So one of the recurring challenges that we do see, right, as we navigate this space is the fact that businesses don't generally qualify for credit. And that's purely because they lack credit history and they also lack financial documentation. And I think it's for this reason that we've obviously looked at various other funding methods. I think the Prof touched on things like blended financing. So obviously including that into part of our mix in terms of how we service the SMEs. And that we've done quite successfully through our enterprise development funding space. So I'll make an example. I think one of the success stories that we have in as far as this is concerned is an agri-tech company, Kula. So Kula essentially connects small businesses or rather small-scale farmers who want to sell their produce to buyers via its application. So we first supported Kula, I suppose, with enterprise development funding in 2018. They've done phenomenally well over the years. And in 2023, we actually went further by actually taking a stake in their business, a minority stake in their business. And earlier this year, again, there were more expansion plans that they were putting into place. Case in point, I think what you've cited, Prof, in terms of some of the companies wanting to actually drive more investment in their businesses. And we did further funding there with other shareholders to actually enable them to scale. We've also, I suppose, I guess from a credit perspective, we've recently introduced a new asset finance process for items below 2 million to kind of fast track that application process where we have lesser requirements in terms of documentation from the SMEs when they apply for that. And additionally to that as well, just to aid that whole process in terms of speed to market, we've digitized 80% of our credit application process, thereby obviously reducing the time taken to do the assessments that we need to do to evaluate affordability for SMEs and to ensure that we're able to obviously disperse those funds as quickly as they need them. I think additionally as well, our partnership obviously with the likes of Pref Capital as well. I think you touched on cash flow as one of the key issues that do exist in the market. So we've partnered with Preference Capital, and essentially we're able to kind of provision for cash flow lending to businesses in the retail space. And how that is done is obviously it's based on the turnover that reflects on the terminals that they use in terms of point of sale, which are Absa devices. So that essentially is there to also kind of aid with some of the challenges we're seeing around the cash flow aspect. Obviously, to enable clients to build credit record, we've also done more innovation in the credit card space, where we've launched a credit card with a much lower limit. Obviously, that allows the SMEs as well to kind of build a credit record. And also, they also have the ability to top this credit card up. So we start getting that history that we are missing in terms of data points to make informed decisions around lending. So I think one of the most important aspects as well, I think that we need to kind of also look at in terms of how we look at what the report underscores. It's more around collaboration, right? And recognizing that all stakeholders will need to play a massive role in terms of how we create an enabling environment for SMEs. And I mean, speaking to things like access to market. So as Absa, we've partnered strategically with quite a few players in the market as well to kind of enable this. An example I'll use is obviously last year we signed a multi-year agreement with the African Development Bank to enable access to finance for women-owned businesses. And again, I think that's one of the sectors that's quite key in terms of us being able to enable, especially when you look at the history of the country and where we come from. So we're also the sole partners of the South Africa Visa She's Next development program, which is a program that aims to develop women, supporting them from a finance perspective and also enabling them to scale their businesses. So there's another partnership that we've kind of gone into as Absa to try and enable SMEs. Also, I suppose through partnerships with the National Small Business Chamber, women and youth-owned businesses can gain access to networks and also to markets through smart procurement world. So we're helping SMEs with links to procurement buyers and also to corporates. We play quite a key role in that, and I think that's going to be fundamentally important as well as we move forward in terms of creating those opportunities. So also this includes events within the different provinces across the country. So it's not necessarily focused in specific geographies, but we actually focus on the country at large. I think the last thing I'll touch on as well here, from an access to market perspective, is that we have a program called Absa SME Fridays, where basically more than 4,000 businesses have access to all our Absa retail customers that subscribe to our rewards program. And we basically drive traffic to these SMEs through obviously giving cashback rewards to the retail our retail clients who actually purchase from them. Also, from that perspective, if these guys use these our Absa terminals, they're able to then, if they reach certain thresholds in terms of volumes, also get cashback incentives in terms of how we remunerate them there. I suppose as a bank, we remain very committed to fostering strategic partnerships with chambers of business and commerce. Case in point, I suppose the relationship that exists here between us and Saki. We believe that these collaborations enable us to provide SMEs with a range of valuable benefits, including things like facilitating business networking opportunities, specialized training programs, and also, I suppose, initiatives that are also tailored just to support them in terms of the initiatives that they need to drive in terms of building the skills that they need. It's also important to acknowledge, I suppose, the role of non-financial support to establish, I suppose, sustainable SMEs and to also to help them scale. And in this regard, we also believe in digital and online channels in terms of helping SMEs to reach their new target audiences. I think that's one of the key points as well that came out, the fact that that's actually a growing channel. With this in mind, one of the things that we've recently done as Absa is we've launched a commerce platform, e-commerce platform called ShopRed, which essentially offers businesses the ability to showcase their products on this platform and sell them, obviously through the online web creation and hosting. And obviously this integrates also payment options and obviously creates a lot wider variety in terms of access to market, because they're now able to access clients that ordinarily wouldn't access. Additionally, I think the other capability that's quite key here speaks to data, and I think we've spoken quite at length about data and how it informs decision making. So this platform has analytics capability that enables these businesses to actually manage their in-store and online inventory and make decisions around how they run their business. I think from an enterprise supply development perspective as well, I think our bank has played a very proactive role in creating opportunities for SMEs within our own value chain. So if you look at the last 5 years, I think we have invested about 19.4 billion in ESD initiatives. And I think this has had obviously tangible benefits for numerous SMEs. Obviously, this significant investment underscores our unwavering commitment in terms of how we foster opportunities to grow SMEs and to develop them. So furthermore, I think it's also noteworthy that this year actually holds significant importance for our country as obviously the host nation for the G20 summit. And I guess as a major financial institution, we're playing a very active role in several key initiatives there, including the Startup 20, which obviously plays a pivotal role in laying out the groundwork for the G20 summit later this year. So our CEO or group executive who is accountable for small business, Mr. Ronnie Mbatsani, he's actually the deputy chair for the Trade and Market Access Task Force. And obviously we're very committed to leveraging the key insights that we've gained from this report and this survey to inform how we shape policy recommendations that address some of the presenting, I suppose, challenges that are faced by SMEs through Mr. Mbatsani in those platforms. And look, I think as Absa, we recognize that there's a significant amount of work that needs to be done to enable SMEs in terms of where we find ourselves, especially with some of the key highlights that have come out of the report. And I think we are very committed to continuing to explore ways to ensure how we obviously enhance our support for this very important segment. I think that's why we call ourselves the Bank of the Entrepreneur, because we're very committed to making sure that this segment succeeds. And obviously, given the ripple effects it has in terms of how the economy performs as well. So the findings from this report will definitely provide an important reference point for those efforts as we also look internally in terms of how we shape further our propositions and solve for SMEs and our solutions. With that, I'd like to hand over to you, Zelda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lindo, and the audience out there. If you are not banking with Absa, you have heard all the great things that we do. Please do reach out to ourselves. You can also access small business banking on our www.absa.co.za. We also have our nearest branches with bankers that are waiting for you. So please do reach out to Absa. Before we wrap up, while we still have our speakers still on stage, let's answer some of those questions. The first question for you, Jeff. I think we had an issue with the audio earlier, but that was sorted. The speaker was saying it's difficult to actually hear us. But my question to the first speaker is such: to the first speaker is such a reduction in SOC investment. What could be the reason?
So it's great, and first of all, thank you for the question. And it's quite a thoughtful one as well, right? So why aren't we seeing more investment from state-owned companies? So part of that is going to be around balance sheet. You can imagine if you're running a small business yourself, there may be lots of things that you want to do, but you can only leverage so much. You can only choose these projects and not others. And one of the things that we've seen over the last 15 years in a very pronounced way is that Eskom sits with far more debt on its balance sheet now than it did before, and struggling to sell more electricity. Transnet sits with vastly more debt on their balance sheet today than they did before, and therefore that sort of encumbers them when they think about sort of dredging out the old airport in Durban to make for more port space difficult with the debt load that they have and the sort of leverage they want to run with. So part of it just the constraint that perhaps these SOCs now have because their financial positions are just less strong. But then the second part of that is going to be around sort of strategic decisions that are being made by government and others and saying, listen, we're not sure the best way forward here is to run the rail system with the same people doing the same things that we did before that kind of frankly got us into some of this trouble. We might need some fresh ideas, some fresh capital, some more competition in that space. And so the next layer of investment for the big SOCs at least, or the businesses over which they overlook, that next layer of investment will be coming from the private sector, whether that be in rail or rail stock, whether that be in ports and cranes and all the enabling, whether that be in renewables or gas-fired energy production, or even we think about some of the challenges in water that were so very rare. I had no water at my house the last 4 days. I'm very aware personally of the water limits we have. I think the private sector is just going to be a much bigger part of that.
Thank you, Jeff. And I hope, Katlego, from the House of Psychology, you are answered. So to the next question. So to the next question from Katlego, again from the House of Psychology. I see that the insights will be shared with government agencies and other institutions. Did they action these insights, or is this the first time?
Okay. So I think obviously the result came out about 2.5, 3 weeks ago. We've engaged quite broadly with media around the findings. Additionally, I think the points are made around obviously having Mr. Ronnie Mbatsane as part of the chair of the Startup 20. Some of these insights will be surfaced in those conversations to kind of make sure that they are actually shaping and influencing some of the policy decisions that will be made as part of the G20 in terms of how we solve as a country and how we resolve for SMEs. So definitely they are being shared. I can also say that as a country, we find ourselves in a fortunate position where we do have a Department of Small Business Development. And I think what we found is that they're actually quite willing and very willing to partner with the likes of private sector, with the likes of academic institutions, in terms of ensuring that they start accessing some of the true findings, case in point what we've got in this report, to inform some of the decisions that they do make. So I think we have a good relationship as well from that perspective with the Department of Small Business. We have shared the report with them as well. They're quite excited about obviously going through it and seeing what value they can get in terms of the contributions that can actually aid in policy changes. So definitely. And I think also if you do go on the Saki website, you'll be able to, a lot of people have been directed there from a traffic perspective. We've received great feedback in terms of the numbers of the people that are actually accessing that report from there. Not only SMEs, but also, I guess, from an industry perspective, other players, other financial institutions. Because ultimately, I guess this piece of research is not something that we as Absa or Saki or the BMR want to own. It's a piece of research that belongs to the whole country, and we want everyone to kind of make informed decisions around the findings that we do see there in terms of how we enable the space of small business.
Thanks, Mr. Mpanjwa. So the next question is from Terence Lulama, and I think this question I'll direct it to Mr. Mukoki. So given the contents of the report, what is the DSBD appetite to create a conducive environment for SME to thrive. The ecosystem is highly regulated to make it workable for SMEs to access capital. Lastly, more financial resources need to be directed to DSBD for broader support of SMEs. This money has this money has to benefit entrepreneurs, not tenderpreneurs.
Well, thanks, Zelda. We are not ourselves the SPD, but we talk to them all the time. And one of the key ideas of what you are raising is to sit down with them now that the report is there, to deal with the findings specifically, and then to deal with quite a number of the elements of the red tape that we generally experience and the regulations. What we found so far is that they have a very open door policy towards us, and they are always willing to listen when we come to engage with them. And certainly, a lot of these things are things that we are going to tackle with them because they are part of the findings. The idea of access to finance is something that we've already raised with them as it relates to the way the DFIs, the development finance institutions, are actually structured. We do believe very strongly that they tend to generally deal the same as commercial banks do, yet they don't have the same element of risks. You know, a commercial bank, generally, the last time I checked, you know, the capital reserve requirements about maybe 10% of risk-weighted assets. And even in that 10%, from the last time I checked, only 7.5% should be tier one or primary capital, whereas the other 2.5% could be subordinated type instruments. It's very, very, very difficult to articulate a high level of non-performing loans in a commercial bank when 90% of the money that you're using belongs to ordinary depositors. So banks are regulated intensively and correctly so, precisely because they are not using their own money. Whereas the state, it's a very, very different thing that we're articulating can be done, and they need to figure a way that is much more flexible, whether the non-performing loan environment there can even extend to 10, 15, even 20%, and it can be dealt with very differently. So we'll have to sit down with people like Jeff to calculate that even though the DFI's balance sheet cannot necessarily sustain those losses. In a typical example where you've lent out R1 billion and you now are facing 300 million rand worth of losses, are the 700 million rand worth of assets, of loans that were issued in terms of revenue generation, in terms of economic value add, are they not able to wash the face of the 300 million loss? That's where we're moving the equation when it comes to that. But we do believe very strongly that there is that possibility because you've got taxes, you've got VAT, you've got income tax, you've got CIT that is being paid by those 700 million worth of businesses, and the biggest tax, of course, is personal income tax, and the value chain economic opportunities that then would have been created. So I think that the idea of innovation is very important in terms of changing people's mindsets, but only with data will you then be able to convince people that the position that you're bringing to them is very, very valid, and we can put the numbers together, we can calculate. It shouldn't be very difficult to look at, say, the asset base of an IDC and to look at all the loans that are actually successful and to say, but what is the economic value contribution they're actually making with SARS and with all the economies that we have? We should then be able to then change. Maybe we need to change the ideas that you have, not for the DFIs to be taking unnecessary risk, but for them to move across the tolerance level because they are not necessarily using depositors' money. So that's a very, very key idea that we're proposing to them already, and we'll be talking more to them about it, yes.
Thank you, Say. I think this one, Prof, I will ask you to take it for us. So the question is from Koli Wekama from Indoni Farm. From the findings in the baseline, what were the most unexpected insights about the reality small business faces, especially between the rural and urban areas? The second question, how can we as small business ambassadors practically use these findings to influence change and support other businesses in our communities? We have three questions from Koliwe. So the third question, it's about the future support. Are there any plans to develop tools or platforms that will help the ambassadors and small businesses to access to access funding, training, and access to new market on the survey results.
Thank you, Zelda, and thank you so much for the question. I think the point I made around hope comes out not just strongly on urban-rural divide, if I can put it that way, but throughout the country to say, but if you as a business don't have hope, it's already a bad starting point of not having it. So to us, which we were excited about, is that, and I think the way that we structured the survey allowed us to do that comparison between a reflection of the past 12 months and looking ahead in 12 months. And if you start comparing that element of hope excites us. And I would say alongside that, I would like small businesses to treat this small business growth report or ambassador's report in two fashions. Either as a mirror, where they will see where they stand compared to their peers, but also on the other hand as a compass, directing them to guide decisions. And in the report, we are seeing risk nuances or ways of dealing with risk, the survival that we talked about, dealing with resilience and dealing with growth. And if we look at our recent retail trade sales that we released recently, that value retailers that position them to understand the price sensitivity of the market are those who are at advantage in terms of their growth. And then maybe to touch on the third point, in an aftermatch, as we mentioned as a panel this afternoon, we are in the dissemination phase. And one of the initiatives that will run alongside the second half survey will be a branded element which we refer to as small tips for small business. And we will take extracts from this to not only share from the research, but talking to the SACIs, talking to the Absas, talking to formal businesses to share with us their business ideas of how can we grow, how can we become resilient. So hopefully I've answered all three of those, but those are my thoughts. Thank you, Zal.
Thank you, Prof. Appreciate that. To Lindo, we have a question from Rotondwa Musita from Trash Converters. What are the primary challenges SMEs face in accessing finance today, especially when we consider the tribunal lend with assets it's not regarded as a security, and how is the bank working to address this?
Okay. So I think one of the areas we touched on is the lack of credit history, which obviously a lot of people kind of struggle with. Secondly, I think the collateral element as well is something that is quite there. When you consider, I guess, the SMEs, especially when you look at the micro SMEs, they're not likely to have any collateral to kind of put forward when they start looking for, obviously, financing options. And I guess that's where, I guess, some of the finding facts here kind of confirm the fact that we need to start taking a different stance in terms of how we actually look at how we basically service some of those requirements. And that speaks to the blended financing options. And I guess that's where, for me, I think we as Absa, doors are always open, and we want SMEs to approach us. We've got an enterprise development function that aids us in terms of looking at how we kind of solution for the businesses that find themselves in spaces where there isn't collateral in terms of what they require, right? And I guess the example that we made with the likes of Kula speaks to some of the examples in terms of success case stories where we've been able to actually aid people in the beginning of their journey as they move forward. I think also I touched on the credit card with the lower limits. Again, we want to, those are some of the interventions we're kind of putting in place in terms of enabling SMEs to kind of build that credit record and build that credit footprint for us to be able to make better decisions in terms of how we aid them from a lending perspective. So there are quite a few solutions that sit in the bank, and we encourage SMEs to approach and sit with us. We've got sector expertise as well that I kind of touched on, where we've got deep sector expertise who can sit with you, look at your business if you're in the retail space, understand exactly what the requirement is, understand what options you have in the absence of collateral in terms of how we can enable you, and as we move forward as well. And then I think the last piece I'll also touch on is, I suppose, is the partnerships as well. And I think Mr. Mokoki kind of touched on it, right? There are certain guarantees as well in place that we can leverage as a bank, as and when we on lend to, let's call it, businesses that don't necessarily have collateral, so we kind of mitigate the risk. So there are quite a few instruments that we do explore in that regard. And we, again, our doors are open for business. If we want to talk to you, we want to help you, we want to enable you to access the funding.
Thank you, Lindo. You've heard it. Our doors are open. Please do reach out to us. So the next question, Prof, it's from Maxwell, from Clearview Group. Thank you for unpacking of the SME data. We truly appreciate the effort and the ongoing deliberations and collaborations. Please include the market share aspect that we are experiencing. You find a small business is competent in providing services with limited resources, but then there is no support relating to market linkages so that we can penetrate the market. Please introduce these aspects for a big business to open doors for us, and government programs to have a layer for market-ready business who have been operating for 3 years with a solid track record and showing stability. This must be given an opportunity to play roles in public sector procurement to safeguard or handheld throughout, especially the ICT and constructions SMEs.
And thank you once again for the sharing of that thinking. And I think, and hopefully we've been a good agent for the small businesses, voicing on their behalf. This is not our voice. We are sharing it with the nation. But I think a very important point touched on in terms of that response. And if you ask any small business nowadays, what's your biggest concern? Usually the top of the mind of historic response to this, finance. But what we're really seeing in an aftermath of small businesses responding to us in terms of the survey, help us to get or make use of those opportunities which we believe we can provide. And I think and I call it a triangulated approach. We've got the finance side covered through Absa, which will, in their role, provide those opportunities or aspire to provide those opportunities. And then we've got a business agent through Saki to say, but we can hear the voice of the businesses and see how we can support you in that ecosystem. And then from a so-called training education perspective, we've got ourselves as the Bureau of Market Research positioned within the University of South Africa to also look at skills development in terms of the needs of SMMEs, which are quite eloquently tracked as well in the report. So to me, it's about assisting small businesses to nurture that opportunities which they believe they can put out there and respond to. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Prof. We will take our last question, and it will go to Mr. Ellen Mukoki. Do you think policy and other interventions will change as a result of the findings?
Well, we hope that we will make an impact in terms of being able to influence people. I think that the environment, as you've seen with the national dialogue and all these kinds of things that are taking place, this is not the type of work that is threatening anyone. It's not doing anything that is causing damage. It's actually doing everything that is enhancing, amplifying the solutions that they, who are policymakers and decision makers, would be very to know of. So it's almost like we've done the work for them. But for the betterment of South Africa and business in general. So we are hopeful, and at least in an environment where there are so many platforms that have now been created for government and business engagement, this is going to come in handy. So we will know, at least as Jeff was saying earlier on, we've participated as well on a lot of the programs between government and business that led to Operation Vulindlela, and we've seen some success because there are ministers who come to those things. Even this piece of work will actually end up in that Operation Vulindlela because we have that access point as well.
Thank you, Mr. Mukoki, and thank you for allowing us another minute or two to actually take one more question. So this question, Lindo, please, if you can take it for us. Besides engaging policymakers and other interest groups, what steps Absa or Psyche or BMR take from here to ensure the project has longevity and impact?
Okay. So I guess as part of the survey that was done in April, May, we also introduced the ambassador program. And essentially for us, that ambassador program ensures that this piece of work is not an ABSA, Saki or PMR piece of work. It's a piece of work that is actually owned by the voices that actually inform the insights that we see in there. So therefore, I guess, I mean, this session that we are having now, this webinar, it has the voices again in terms of the questions that are surfacing there and driving conversation here of the SMEs that have actually given us the insights into the report. At the end of this year, we will have another session where we have an awards session for the SMEs that actually participate and actually go forward with this ambassador program, ensuring that there's continuous touch points and engagements with them as we move through this process so that their voice is never lost anyway in the data points as we progress these discussions through various forums, through up into government spaces, through other institutions as well in terms of how we ultimately create an enabling environment for them. So as this process continues going forward, they'll always be part and parcel of the voices that sit in the room, and hence we're saying we essentially sitting in the room with them at this point in time, as we break down the findings, as we speak to some of the solutions that exist, and also as we speak to some of the work that is going to happen moving forward to make sure that these voices find meaning in the policies that shape how we enable this environment.
Thank you, Lindo, and thank you to all the SMEs out there. Your voice has been heard, and thank you for joining us as well this afternoon. I will now hand over back to Lindo to close us out. Over to you, Mr. Mpanjwa.
Thank you once again, Zelda. First and foremost, I think I want to once again thank the 1,600 voices that have informed this piece of work. I think without your contributions, this piece of work would not be the success that we are seeing it to become in terms of the insights that it's giving us, in terms of what we need to solve for as a country, for a segment that we see as very important. I mean, I think if one of the points that's been made through and through over and over across various sessions that I've been in is the fact that if you look at first world countries, their success doesn't sit on the back of big businesses. It sits on the back of SMEs like yourselves actually driving those economies. So your voices are important in terms of how we kind of direct and shape the future of this country. Then over and above that, I'd also like to thank our partners, Saki, who've played a very pivotal role in terms of getting us to the point that we're at in this piece of work that we're doing. I'd like to thank the BMR for the amazing work that they've done on this piece of research. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Jeff and Zelda as well, for their participation this afternoon. I think the macro insights that you gave were quite key, as you would have seen from the questions that have come through. And over and above that, I think we want to just make sure that the SMEs stay with us on this journey. So those ambassadors, please don't drop off. Your voices are important in terms of shaping how this thing comes together as we move forward. Thank you very much for your time.